Imagine waking up in the middle of the night on a freezing mountain. You hear something outside your tent. You don't stop to put on your shoes. Instead, you grab a knife, cut your way through the tent from the inside, and run into the darkness. But why? That is exactly what investigators discovered when they found the abandoned tent of 9 experienced hikers in the Ural Mountains of Russia in 1959. Their shoes and warm clothing were still inside. Some of the hikers were found only partially dressed, and several had suffered severe injuries. The strangest part: in January 1959, a group of 10 experienced university students and hikers from the Soviet Union began an expedition through the northern Ural Mountains. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, an experienced 23-year-old hiker. The group planned to cross a difficult mountain region and eventually reach their destination. But only one member would turn back early because of illness. The remaining 9 hikers continued. They never returned. When they failed to make contact, a search party was eventually organized. On February 26th, rescuers discovered something disturbing. The hikers' tent had been found on the snowy slope of Kolatsyakal, a mountain whose name is often translated from the local Mansi language as Dead Mountain. But the tent wasn't simply abandoned. It appeared that the group had left suddenly. Inside were their clothing, boots, equipment, and personal belongings. That created one of the biggest questions of the entire mystery. Why would experienced hikers leave their warm shelter without properly dressing themselves? Investigators found that the tent had been cut open from the inside. Outside, footprints appeared to lead downhill. The footprints suggested that at least some of the hikers had left wearing little more than socks or bare feet. Temperatures that night were believed to have fallen to around 30 degrees Celsius or even lower. Leaving the tent under those conditions could be fatal within a short time. And yet something had apparently convinced them to do exactly that. The first bodies were found several hundred meters away from the tent, near a forest. Others were discovered later in a ravine. Some had died from hypothermia, but several bodies had serious injuries. There were fractures and other trauma that seemed unusual for people who had simply frozen to death. This led to decades of speculation. Some theories claimed an avalanche. Others suggested a military accident. Some blamed an unknown phenomenon. And of course, there were much stranger theories. In theories, one possibility is that a snow slab or avalanche-like event caused the hikers to fear that their tent was in danger. They could have quickly escaped downhill, intending to reach the forest and return once the danger passed. But poor visibility and extreme cold may have prevented them from finding their way back. Another theory involved katabatic winds, powerful winds that can rush down mountain slopes and create terrifying conditions. There were also theories involving military activity, because the area was part of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Some witnesses later reported strange lights in the sky around the time of the incident, adding fuel to speculation. But none of these theories immediately answered every question. The biggest mystery. The most fascinating part isn't simply that 9 people died. It's the sequence of events. Why did they cut their way out of the tent? Why did they leave valuable clothing behind? Why did they separate into groups? And what caused the severe injuries found on some of the bodies? For decades, the Dyatlov Pass incident became one of the world's most famous unsolved mysteries. However, modern research has provided a more ordinary possibility. A delayed snow slab avalanche combined with severe weather and poor visibility could potentially explain much of what happened. That doesn't make the story any less haunting, because even if the mystery has a natural explanation, one question remains. What happened during those final moments inside the tent? And that is why, more than 6 decades later, the Dyatlov Pass incident continues to fascinate people around the world. Mystery number 2, the Mary Celeste, the ship with no crew. Imagine discovering a ship drifting alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The sails are still partly raised. The cargo is still aboard. Food and water remain. The ship itself is seaworthy. But there is not a single person on board. No captain, no sailors, no passengers, no bodies, nothing. This is the strange story of the Mary Celeste, one of the most famous maritime mysteries in history. In November 1872, The American merchant ship Mary Celeste left New York Harbor bound for Genoa, Italy. On board were Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their young daughter Sophia, and 7 crew members. The ship carried a valuable cargo of industrial alcohol. At first, everything appeared normal, but somewhere in the Atlantic, something went terribly wrong. The discovery. On December 4th, another ship called the Dei Gratia spotted the Mary Celeste drifting strangely. The crew tried to signal the ship. There was no response. Eventually, a boarding party climbed aboard. What they found was deeply unsettling. The entire crew had disappeared, yet the ship wasn't destroyed. There was no obvious sign of a violent struggle. The ship still contained supplies. The cargo was largely intact, and the lifeboat was missing. What was left behind? Investigators discovered several clues. The ship had food and water remaining. Personal possessions were still aboard. The captain's navigation equipment was missing, suggesting he may have taken it with him. The ship's papers were also largely gone. But there was no clear explanation for why everyone would abandon a ship that appeared capable of continuing its voyage. The most important clue may have been the missing lifeboat. Perhaps the crew had voluntarily left the ship. But why? What could have happened? One theory suggests that the crew believed the ship was about to explode. The cargo included barrels of alcohol, and investigators later found evidence suggesting that some barrels had leaked. If alcohol vapor had accumulated inside the ship, Captain Briggs might have feared an explosion. He could have ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily. But if the ship drifted away from them, or if the lifeboat became separated during bad weather, they may never have been able to return. Another possibility involves rough seas and a sudden weather event. The crew could have entered the lifeboat while remaining connected to the Mary Celeste by a line. If that line broke, the ship might have sailed away while the people in the lifeboat were left behind. And in the vast Atlantic Ocean, their chances of survival would have been extremely small. Over the years, the Mary Celeste story became increasingly sensational. Some versions claimed there was blood everywhere. Others claimed the ship contained half-eaten meals sitting on the table. These details were heavily exaggerated or invented by later stories. The real mystery is actually more interesting. There was no definitive evidence of a massacre, piracy, or supernatural event. Instead, we have a ship that was found abandoned under circumstances that still cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The Mary Celeste continued sailing for years after the disappearance, but the fate of the 10 people who left it remains unknown. Did they believe the ship was about to explode? Did a sudden storm separate them from the vessel? Did a navigational mistake lead to their disappearance? Or was there another explanation that history has lost? More than 150 years later, we still don't know exactly what happened to Captain Briggs, his family, and the crew. And perhaps the most disturbing question is this: what could make an experienced captain abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the ocean? Mystery number 3, the Oak Island Money Pit. For more than 200 years, people have been digging into one small island in Canada, searching for something that may or may not be buried beneath it. Some believe it could be pirate treasure. Others think it may be an ancient manuscript, royal treasure, or something far more ordinary. But the strangest part is what happened when people began digging. They discovered layers of wood, clay, stone, and unusual underground structures that seemed to make the search almost impossible. This became known as the Oak Island Money Pit. Oak Island is a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. According to the famous story, in 1795, a teenager named Daniel McGinnis noticed a strange depression in the ground beneath an oak tree. There appeared to be signs that someone had previously disturbed the area. McGinnis returned with friends and began digging. At first, it seemed like an ordinary hole, but then they discovered something strange. At regular intervals underground, they encountered layers of wooden logs. The deeper they dug, the more complicated the structure seemed to become. The diggers believed they had discovered a hidden treasure chamber. They continued downward, but then water began flooding the excavation. They tried pumping it out. The water kept returning. This created one of the greatest mysteries surrounding Oak Island. Was the pit deliberately engineered to flood? Some later investigators believed the original builders had created a sophisticated drainage system connected to the surrounding ocean. If true, whoever constructed it would have gone to extraordinary lengths to protect whatever was hidden below. What could be buried there? Over the years, countless theories have emerged. One theory says pirates buried treasure on the island. Another claims it could be treasure belonging to the Knights Templar. Others have suggested lost manuscripts, royal treasures, or even Shakespearean documents. But there is an important problem. No definitive evidence has ever proved that a legendary treasure is actually buried there. Many supposed discoveries have turned out to be misunderstood objects or artifacts whose origins remain uncertain. The Curse Oak Island also developed a famous legend that 7 people must die before the treasure can be found. Several people have died during the centuries of treasure hunting, which has kept the legend alive. But there is no reliable evidence that an actual supernatural curse exists. The island itself is dangerous enough. Collapsed tunnels, unstable ground, flooding, and difficult excavation conditions have caused numerous accidents. The biggest question. The real mystery isn't simply, where is the treasure? It's, who created the strange underground structures, and why? If the original structures were deliberately constructed, who built them? And why would someone go to such enormous effort to hide something on a remote island? Despite generations of searching, Oak Island has never produced a universally accepted answer. Perhaps there really is a priceless treasure hidden deep beneath the island. Or perhaps the greatest treasure is the mystery itself, the story that has kept people digging for more than 2 centuries. And after all this time, one question remains. What is really buried beneath Oak Island? Mystery number 4, the Taos Hum, the sound nobody can find. Imagine hearing a strange, deep buzzing sound every night. You check your house, nothing. You go outside, the sound is still there. You drive somewhere else. Sometimes you can still hear it. But when scientists bring recording equipment to find the source, they can't clearly identify it. This is the mystery known as the Taos Hum, a sound with no obvious source. In the early 1990s, residents of Taos, New Mexico, began reporting a persistent low-frequency noise. People described it in different ways: a distant diesel engine, a deep vibration, a humming refrigerator, or a low rumbling sound coming from somewhere underground. The reports became so widespread that the phenomenon attracted scientific attention. But there was a strange problem. Not everyone could hear it. Some residents heard the noise clearly. Others standing in the exact same location heard absolutely nothing. Scientists investigate researchers attempted to measure the sound. They searched for industrial equipment, electrical infrastructure, machinery, and other possible sources. But no single source could explain all the reports. Some investigations detected unusual low-frequency signals. Others failed to find anything unusual at all. That created an important possibility. Maybe there wasn't one mysterious sound affecting everyone. Maybe different people were experiencing different phenomena. Could it be inside the human ear? One explanation is called spontaneous autoacoustic emissions. Our ears aren't simply passive microphones. The inner ear contains tiny structures that can generate extremely faint sounds. In some people, those sounds may become noticeable. Another possibility is tinnitus, where a person perceives a sound even when there is no corresponding external sound. But these explanations don't necessarily explain every report associated with the Taos Hum. Could it be machinery? Another possibility is that the sound comes from ordinary human technology. Large electrical equipment, industrial machinery, ventilation systems, engines, or distant transportation can produce extremely low-frequency vibrations. These sounds can travel surprisingly far. And because low frequencies can be difficult to locate, the apparent direction of the sound can be misleading. You may think the noise is coming from your house, when it could actually be coming from kilometers away. The strange part, Taos isn't the only place where people have reported unexplained humming. Similar reports have appeared in other locations around the world. That has led some people to believe there may be a global phenomenon. But scientists have not established a single worldwide source. different hums may actually have completely different causes. So what is the Taos Hum? After decades of reports, there is still no single universally accepted explanation for the Taos Hum. It could involve environmental noise, industrial activity, low-frequency vibrations, human hearing, or a combination of several factors. And that's what makes the mystery so fascinating, because the people who hear it aren't necessarily imagining it. They really do perceive something. The difficult question is, are they hearing a sound coming from the world around them, or a sound being produced somewhere inside themselves? And until the source can be definitively identified, the Taos Hum remains one of the strangest unexplained sounds in the world. Mystery number 5, the Somerton Man, the man with no name. Imagine finding a dead man on a beach. He has no identification, no wallet, no passport, no obvious injuries, and the labels have been removed from his clothes. Then investigators discover a tiny piece of paper hidden in his pocket. It contains only 2 words, Tamam Shud. Those words would turn an unidentified death into one of Australia's most famous mysteries. The body on the beach. On December 1st, 1948, a man was found dead on Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia. He appeared to be peacefully resting against a seawall. At first, police couldn't determine who he was. His fingerprints were taken, but they didn't immediately produce a match. His clothing contained no identification. Even more strangely, the labels inside some of his clothes had been carefully removed. Who was this man? And why did he seem determined to leave no trace of his identity? Investigators examined everything he had with him. They found items such as cigarettes, chewing gum, and other ordinary belongings, but there was nothing that revealed his name. Then investigators discovered something even stranger. A tiny piece of paper had been hidden inside a secret pocket sewn into his clothing. Printed on it were the words, Tamam Shud. The phrase means roughly ended or finished in Persian. The paper had apparently been torn from the final page of a rare book of poetry called The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Now the case became much more mysterious. The book police eventually found a copy of the book from which the paper had been torn. Inside were several handwritten letters. They looked like a code. Nobody could definitively determine what they meant. Was it a secret message? A military code? A personal message? Or simply meaningless writing? The book became one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. The mysterious woman. Another strange clue emerged. Investigators discovered that a woman living nearby had reportedly owned a copy of the same book. She was questioned by police but denied knowing the dead man. Over the years, speculation grew that she might have been connected to him. Some theories suggested espionage. Remember, this happened during the early years of the Cold War, when intelligence operations were a major concern. Could the Somerton Man have been a spy? There was never definitive proof. A modern breakthrough. For decades, the man's identity remained unknown. Then modern DNA technology changed the investigation. Researchers used genetic genealogy to examine DNA connected to the case and eventually identified the man as Carl Charles Webb, an Australian electrical engineer. If that identification is correct, it solves one of the biggest questions. Who was the Somerton Man? But it doesn't solve everything. The mystery remains. Why was Webb found dead on the beach? Why were the labels removed from his clothing? Why did he have the mysterious Tamam Shud message? Was he involved in espionage? Was the code actually a code? Or was the entire mystery created by coincidence and circumstances that investigators misunderstood? Even with modern technology potentially identifying the man, the circumstances surrounding his death remain deeply mysterious. For more than 70 years, he had no name. Today, we may finally know who he was. But the bigger question remains, why did Carl Webb end up alone and dead on Somerton Beach? Mystery number 6, the Green Children of Woolpit. Imagine 2 children suddenly appearing in a medieval English village. They look human, but their skin is strangely green. They speak a language nobody understands. They refuse ordinary food. and they claim they came from a mysterious underground world. This sounds like fantasy, but the story was recorded by medieval writers and has fascinated historians for centuries. The Strange Children. The story supposedly took place in the village of Woolpit, England, sometime in the 12th century. According to medieval accounts, villagers discovered two children near one of the village's wolf pits. They were dressed in unfamiliar clothing, but the strangest thing about them was their appearance. Their skin had a greenish color. The villagers tried to communicate with them. The children couldn't understand English. They appeared frightened and confused. They wouldn't eat. The villagers offered the children normal food, but they refused. Eventually, they were given green beans. The children apparently accepted them and began eating. Over time, they learned to eat other foods, and as their diet changed, their unusual green coloration reportedly began to disappear. Eventually, they looked like ordinary children. A mysterious language. Once the children learned enough English to communicate, they were asked where they came from. Their answer was extraordinary. They said they came from a place where everything was green. According to the story, they had been tending livestock when they discovered a strange passage. They entered it and eventually emerged into the world above. But they couldn't explain exactly where their homeland was. Another world? Some versions of the story claim the children described a world where the sun never appeared normally. Everything seemed to have a strange greenish appearance. This led later storytellers to suggest that the children had somehow entered another dimension. But there is absolutely no scientific evidence that such a place existed, so historians have searched for more ordinary explanations. Possible explanations. One possibility is that the children were simply malnourished. Severe malnutrition can cause unusual skin coloration and weakness. Another possibility is that they were immigrants from a nearby region whose language was unfamiliar to the villagers. Their clothing and language may simply have seemed strange because of cultural differences. There's also a theory that the story may have been exaggerated over time. Remember, the account was written down long after the supposed event. Medieval writers often mixed historical events with folklore and supernatural stories. What happened to them? According to the traditional account, the children eventually adapted to their new environment. The boy reportedly became sick and died. The girl survived and was baptized. She supposedly learned English and eventually lived among the local population. But the exact historical identity of these children remains uncertain. The mystery: did two unusual children really appear in Woolpit? Were they suffering from malnutrition and separated from their family? Were they refugees from another community? Or was the entire story transformed into legend over the centuries? We may never know, because there is one haunting detail at the center of the story. Two children supposedly appeared from nowhere, speaking a language nobody understood, and claimed they came from a world beneath our own. Mystery number 7, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Mystery. Imagine arriving at a remote lighthouse in the middle of the ocean. You expect 3 lighthouse keepers to greet you. Instead, there is no one. The lighthouse is locked, the beds are empty, the lamp is prepared, and 3 men have completely disappeared. No bodies, no witnesses, no clear explanation. This is the strange case of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. A remote lighthouse. The Flannan Isles are a group of remote islands off the western coast of Scotland. In 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers were stationed at the lighthouse on Eilean Moor. Their names were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Their job was simple but dangerous. Keep the lighthouse operating and make sure its powerful lamp remained visible to ships passing through the surrounding waters. But in December 1900, something went terribly wrong. The mysterious discovery. On December 26th, the relief ship Hesperus arrived at the island. The crew immediately noticed something was wrong. Nobody came out to greet them. The lighthouse should have been operating normally, but there was no response. Eventually, the relief crew entered the lighthouse. The 3 keepers were gone. Completely gone. What they found inside: investigators found signs that the lighthouse had been maintained. The lamp and machinery were reportedly in working order, but the men's absence was immediately suspicious. Some of their clothing was missing. One of the keepers' outdoor gear appeared to be gone, and there were reports of damage around the landing area. This suggested that at least one of the men may have gone outside during extremely dangerous weather. But why would all three leave the lighthouse? The storm theory. The official explanation eventually focused on the sea. A powerful storm may have created enormous waves around the island. One keeper may have gone outside to secure equipment. Another may have followed. A third may have gone after them. A giant wave could have swept them all into the sea. It sounds simple, but there was a problem. Why would experienced lighthouse keepers put themselves in such danger at the same time? The logbook. The case became even stranger because of reports about entries in the lighthouse logbook. Some accounts claimed the keepers wrote about terrifying storms and unusual behavior. However, later investigations questioned the authenticity or interpretation of some of these dramatic details. This is important because many versions of the story have become exaggerated over the years. The original evidence doesn't necessarily support the most sensational claims. Theories over the decades, people proposed almost everything. Some suggested a giant wave. Others imagined piracy. Some even suggested that the men had fought with each other. There were also supernatural theories involving ghosts or mysterious forces on the island. But there is no solid evidence for anything supernatural. The harsh environment provides a much more realistic explanation. The final mystery. No bodies were ever recovered. That means investigators could never reconstruct the final moments with certainty. Perhaps one man was swept away by a wave. The others tried to rescue him. And then another massive wave struck. Within minutes, all three could have disappeared into the Atlantic. Or perhaps something else happened. We simply don't know. More than a century later, the lighthouse still stands as a reminder of the three men who disappeared without leaving a clear trace. And the question remains, what happened on Island Moor that night? And why did three experienced lighthouse keepers never come home? Mystery 8, the Max Headroom broadcast hijacking. Imagine you're watching television late at night. Suddenly, the program disappears. The screen goes black. Then a strange person wearing a rubber Max Headroom mask appears. They begin speaking nonsense. The broadcast becomes distorted. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stops. Nobody knows who did it. This really happened. The first hijacking. On November 22, 1987, viewers in Chicago were watching television when something extraordinary happened. During a broadcast on WGN-TV, the station's signal was interrupted. For approximately 25 seconds, viewers saw a person wearing a Max Headroom mask and dark sunglasses. Max Headroom was a fictional television character popular at the time, but this wasn't an official appearance. Someone had somehow taken control of the television signal. Then it happened again. About 2 hours later, something even stranger happened. Another Chicago television station, WTTW, was broadcasting Doctor Who. The signal was hijacked again. This time, the interruption lasted much longer, roughly 90 seconds. The masked person appeared on screen again. They moved strangely. They spoke in distorted fragments. There were bizarre references to advertisements, television personalities, and other seemingly random subjects. At one point, the person appeared to be holding an object resembling a can of Pepsi. Then the screen suddenly returned to the television program. How did they do it? This is what makes the incident so fascinating. Hijacking a television broadcast wasn't something an ordinary person could easily accomplish. The attacker needed specialized equipment and had to transmit a stronger signal than the legitimate station. In other words, someone knew what they were doing. The second hijacking was particularly impressive because WTTW's transmitter was located on top of the Sears Tower, making the signal difficult to overpower. Yet somebody managed to do it. The investigation. The Federal Communications Commission and other authorities investigated, but the culprit was never officially identified. There were no arrests, no confirmed motive, and no definitive explanation for why the person chose Max Headroom. The attacker seemed more interested in confusing and entertaining people than delivering a political message. Who was behind it? Over the years, investigators and internet researchers have proposed many theories. Maybe it was a technically skilled prankster. Maybe it was a group of people experimenting with broadcast equipment. Maybe the person worked in television. Or perhaps they had access to equipment belonging to a television facility. But despite decades of speculation, nobody has conclusively identified the hijacker. Why Max Headroom? That's another mystery. The person wasn't simply wearing a random mask. They deliberately chose Max Headroom, a character strongly associated with television and technology. The choice may have been part of the joke. The hijacker was essentially turning television itself into the target of the prank. The unsolved ending. Imagine watching television in 1987 and suddenly seeing a masked stranger take control of the station. There was no internet to instantly explain what was happening. No social media, no smartphones. For viewers at home, it must have been incredibly disturbing. And then the signal returned to normal. The person disappeared. And more than 3 decades later, the identity of the Max Headroom hijacker remains unknown. The biggest question isn't whether it happened. We know it did. The real mystery is, who had the technical skill, equipment, and motivation to hijack 2 Chicago television stations? And why did they do it? Mystery number 9, the lead masks case. Imagine 2 men being discovered dead on a hillside in Brazil. They're wearing suits, they're wearing raincoats, and over their eyes are homemade lead masks. Beside them is a mysterious note containing instructions that nobody has ever fully explained. There is no obvious sign of violence, no clear cause of death, and no definitive answer about what they were doing there. This became known as the lead masks case. The discovery. On August 20th, 1966, 2 technicians named Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana were found dead on Morro do Vintém, a hill near Niterói, Brazil. The scene immediately looked strange. Both men were dressed formally. They wore raincoats despite the weather. And over their eyes were strange homemade lead masks. The masks appeared to have been designed to protect their eyes from something. But from what? The mysterious note. Investigators discovered a notebook or piece of paper near the bodies. It contained a series of instructions, including a time to take something, and instructions involving waiting for a signal. The meaning was never established. There was no clear explanation of what the men were waiting for, and investigators couldn't determine exactly what happened during their final hours. What were they doing? One theory is that the men were involved in some kind of spiritual or paranormal experiment. Reports suggested that they were interested in UFOs and unusual phenomena. Some people believed they were attempting to make contact with extraterrestrials. Others suspected they were experimenting with drugs or chemicals. But here's the problem. There was never enough evidence to conclusively prove any of these theories. The cause of death. Perhaps the biggest problem was that investigators couldn't establish a definitive cause of death. The bodies were reportedly badly decomposed by the time they were examined. Without a clear toxicological answer, investigators couldn't determine whether the men had taken something, been poisoned, or died from another cause. And because the scene contained so few obvious clues, speculation exploded. The UFO theory. The strangest theory became the most famous. Some believed the men were waiting for a UFO. The lead masks were supposedly intended to protect their eyes from intense light or radiation. The note was interpreted as instructions for some kind of scheduled encounter. But there is no verified evidence that a UFO was involved. It remains speculation. Another possibility, a more ordinary explanation, is that the men were experimenting with substances or participating in a dangerous ritual. Perhaps something went wrong, but again, without definitive forensic evidence, this remains only a possibility. Why the masks? That is the image that made this case unforgettable. Why would 2 men climb a remote hill wearing lead masks over their eyes? What were they expecting to see? Why did they bring so little equipment? And what was the meaning of the strange instructions? The investigation never produced a universally accepted answer. Even today, the lead mask's case remains one of Brazil's strangest unsolved mysteries. Two men climbed a hill. They put on lead masks, they waited, and whatever they expected to happen, they never came back down. Mystery number 10, the man who came from Taured. Imagine arriving at an international airport with a passport from a country that doesn't exist. The immigration officer looks at the passport. The country is real, according to the traveler. But according to every map and government record, it has never existed. The traveler becomes confused. Then something even stranger happens. He eventually disappears. This is the famous story of the man from Taured, the airport encounter. The story is usually said to have happened in Japan in the 1950s or 1960s. A mysterious traveler arrived at an airport carrying a passport. He appeared completely ordinary. He spoke several languages. He had money. He had business documents. But there was one problem. His passport listed his home country as Taured. Immigration officials were confused. They couldn't find Taured on any map. So they asked the traveler where his country was. According to the legend, he pointed toward the region between France and Spain. The location was apparently Andorra. But the traveler insisted that Andorra was not his country. His country was Taured, the strange passport. The traveler reportedly became angry because he believed Taured had existed for centuries. He showed officials stamps from previous trips. He claimed he had traveled internationally before without any problems. Everything appeared legitimate. Except for one enormous problem. Taured didn't exist. Authorities eventually detained him while they investigated. They reportedly placed him in a secure hotel room. A guard was stationed outside. The doors were secured. The windows were supposedly several floors above the ground. The next morning, the man was gone. The impossible disappearance. According to the legend, authorities searched the room. There was no obvious way for him to escape. His documents were also supposedly missing. The story became an incredible tale of a traveler who had somehow crossed into our world from an alternate reality. But there's a major problem. The real story. There is no reliable evidence that a man from a parallel universe arrived at a Japanese airport. The story appears to have been heavily distorted over time. Researchers have connected parts of the legend to a real case involving a traveler whose documents caused suspicion. One likely source is the case of a man named John Zegras, who was detained in Japan after traveling with questionable documents. So where did Taured come from? The fictional country may have been inspired by the real country of Andorra, located between France and Spain. Over time, retellings transformed a strange immigration case into something much more mysterious. A traveler from another dimension, a parallel Earth, a country that existed in another timeline, and a man who disappeared without a trace. The real mystery. The truth is actually more interesting than the legend. How did a real-world story become transformed into one of the most famous parallel universe mysteries on the internet? We may never know exactly when every detail was added. But one thing is clear. There is no solid evidence that the man from Taured came from another dimension. The story survives because it asks one irresistible question. What if, somewhere in the world, another version of Earth exists, and one day someone accidentally finds a way through?